I want you to consider for a moment that every thought you had, every emotion you felt, all those things on the inside, that they were somehow displayed on the outside for everyone to see. Can you imagine what that might be like? Imagine one of those news tickers at the bottom of the TV screen. You know what those are with the news coming across. Imagine one of those plastered across your forehead so that everyone who saw you and talked to you could read what is happening inside you, what you really think, what you really feel, your thoughts, your fears, your hopes, your dreams, your criticisms. I mean, can you imagine conversations maybe at dinner and you're saying nice things, but on your little screen it says your hair looks awful? It could be awkward. It could be embarrassing. Imagine if people could know your every thought, could know your every feeling. It would certainly put us in some embarrassing situations sometimes, some awkward situations sometimes. For some of us, maybe it would just be blank most of the time. We're not thinking anything, we're not feeling anything, there's just dots going across the screen. But I have a feeling most of us, there would be something there. And it might not necessarily reflect our words on the outside or our facial expressions or gestures. Because we become professionals at separating what's on the inside from what is visible on the outside. Don't we? Plastered smiles, conditioned responses, calm demeanor. And yet so often on the inside there is a different narrative playing out. There's a different story being told. But we don't necessarily want other people to know that story. We don't want them to see what we're feeling, what we're thinking, especially when we're feeling and thinking things that aren't honorable, that we're ashamed of, that are embarrassing. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is trying to bring those two realms together. The inside, the outside. Outward conduct should reflect inward conviction. And that's what Jesus is getting at in the Sermon on the Mount. The two should align. We call it authenticity, genuineness, integrity. The Bible calls it not being double-minded. Jesus says it is the nature of life in God's kingdom. And so in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus gives new commentary on the old law, he's not revising the old law. He's not saying, well, that was God's first draft, but now we have made improvements. We've made some edits. No, what he is doing is he is getting to the heart of the matter, trying to align people's outward appearance, their external behaviors, with a heart and a mind that are fixed on God, that are reflective of life in the kingdom of God. And so Jesus aims at the heart. And the issues, the subjects, the topics, the things that Jesus addresses in the Sermon on the Mount, they are not time-specific. They are not just for Israel, who are trying somehow to keep the old law. They're not for the first century. They are timeless. They apply to even us today. And maybe none is more relevant than what Jesus says next in the Sermon on the Mount. If you have a Bible, open it to Matthew chapter 5. Let's reread the passage that was read just a few moments ago. The words of Jesus, verse 27. He says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.'" And certainly they had heard that, probably many times over. It was in the law. Exodus 20, verse 14. They knew that law. But Jesus doesn't stop there, does he? He doesn't say, put a check by that box and let's move on to the next one. Jesus continues, verse 28. "But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell." Now keep in mind, there are some men called scribes. And scribes have been assigned a very important job. And their job is to preserve the law and to impart the law. And the scribes went out of their way to make a real distinction between what's on the inside and what's on the outside. A person's intentions and desires versus a person's actions and behaviors. And so when it comes to something like sexual sin, for them, it was only a problem if a man acted on his desires by taking another man's wife. To have those desires, to have those lusts inside the mind and the heart, for them it wasn't a real issue. But Jesus comes along and he says, no. That's not the whole story. You can't separate someone's intentions, their desires, from their actions. They are all related. And Jesus says, if you have those desires, if you look lustfully on someone else, it is a sin, Jesus says. The word lustfully there in verse 28, that's how the NIV puts it. Some versions say lust after. It's the same Greek word that is in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. In regards to the old law, Exodus 20, verse 17, the law that says you should not covet or desire your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, your neighbor's servant. You shouldn't want what isn't yours. It's the same word there. When Jesus says look lustfully or lust after, he's saying when you see someone or something and it's not yours, but you desire it and you continue to desire it, Jesus says that's wrong. That's a sin. You see, desire materializes within a person, on the inside. Lust begins in the heart. And so that's exactly where Jesus focuses. And I think that's where each one of us need to focus this morning. Jesus knows that if he can address our intentions, that if he can redirect our desires, then he can realign and redirect our behaviors. And so Jesus erases this distinction between what's on the inside and what's on the outside, between desire and action. And by doing that, he takes away the excuse of, I didn't do anything. I didn't really do anything wrong. He takes that away as an excuse to lust. He makes it very clear that you don't have to touch someone to break the seventh commandment. And for us, the same truth persists. Lust is a sin. If sinful desire for something or someone that doesn't belong to you lingers in the heart, it is sinful. We see a great example of this truth in all places the Old Testament. In regards to God's relationship with his people, Israel. That relationship so often was described as a covenant marriage. But so often Israel was prone to breaking the covenant. And they often did that by worshiping false gods, the idols of the neighboring nations. But it wasn't just that behavior of worshiping these idols that got them in trouble, that broke that covenant, that damaged that relationship with God. Notice what the Bible tells us in Ezekiel Chapter 6, verse 8. God says, I will spare some, for some of you will escape the sword when you are scattered among the lands and nations. Then in the nations where they have been carried captive, those who escape will remember me, how I have been grieved by their adulterous, what does he say? Actions, behaviors, worship of other gods. He says their adulterous hearts, which have turned away from me, and by their eyes, which have lusted after their idols. They will loathe themselves for the evil they have done and for all their detestable practices. Hearts and eyes, the gateways to lust. And that lust within us damages our relationship with God, just as it did Israel's relationship with God. And let's be honest, the world around us isn't necessarily our advocate on this, is it? The world around us doesn't have our back. It's not in our corner. In fact, the world around us enables lust, encourages lust, normalizes lust, doesn't it? In this digital age, pornography is pervasive. It is everywhere. Did you know that the annual revenue for the pornography industry is more than the revenue of the world's top technology companies? That's how big this is. Thanks to the internet, pornography is extremely accessible and so often completely anonymous. It is a problem in our society, but it's not just in our society. It is a problem in the church. And let me just make a side note here for a moment and talk to parents. Parents, if you don't know what's happening on your kids' screens, all those screens they have, their phones and tablets and computers and all those other things, you need to know. You need to be actively involved in that. And young people, I'm giving them permission to do that. And you should be thankful that they are involved. Don't be dismissive. Don't be passive. Set up guidelines, safeguards, use filters, have rules, limit time on screens. Most of all, have conversations about this. Don't just think, it won't happen under my roof. It won't happen with my kids. My kids are good kids. I'm sure your kids are good kids. But the world is throwing it at them every single minute. They are being bombarded with temptation when they're not even looking for it. So get involved. Be active in that. But obviously, lust is not just an issue for young people. And although Jesus addresses men in the patriarchal context of his day, lust is also not just a struggle for men. Women also sometimes struggle with lust in its various forms. And of course, while pornography is probably the most pervasive and the easiest and most convenient channel for lust, there are other avenues for lust as well. But all of these things, lust, pornography, illicit affairs, even emotional affairs, all of them have one thing in common, at least one thing, and that is they objectify people. Do you know what I mean? People are no longer created in the image of God, sons and daughters of the King. They are suddenly objects to be used for our own personal desire, to be used for my own needs and wants and pleasures. Did you know that since 1998, almost 18 million women have reported sexual assault? More recently, we've had the Me2 movement, this windfall of charges and accusations and allegations against men and sometimes women for sexual misconduct, for inappropriate behavior or words or actions, many times in the workplace, across the board of industry, right? It doesn't matter if it's acting or sports or college campuses or even churches sometimes, offices. We're hearing more and more as more and more people come to the front and say, someone did something they shouldn't have done. And we should be outraged by these things. Absolutely, we should be outraged. But I got to tell you, we shouldn't be surprised. Why would we be surprised that these things are happening in a culture that devours pornography? In a culture that has a steady diet of things that objectify people? You see, if you continue to feed yourself that, you begin to see people differently. And when you see people, either images or actual people around you, you don't say, that's a precious person made in the image of God. You ask this question, how can I use that person for my own desires? And it conditions the mind And it has emboldened many people with a distorted sense of entitlement that says everyone and everything exists for my pleasure, to meet my needs, my desires. Why would we be surprised that people are no longer just looking at images to meet their desires, but now they feel empowered and emboldened to do and say things to people around them, using them for their own pleasure, doing things that are completely inappropriate, sinful, and sometimes even criminal. And then you look at Jesus, and you look at the Sermon on the Mount, and one of the extraordinary truths that Jesus addresses in this sermon is that God did not create us primarily to consume, to take, but to contribute, to serve, to give. And that's so foreign to the ways of the world. When we give in to lust, we are giving in to a desire to satisfy self, to use whatever is around us, whatever is accessible to please self. We aren't living as salt and light. Remember Jesus said that earlier? You are the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world, meaning you impact the world. You give, you leave an imprint of Christ. When we do that, we aren't salt and light. We are users and takers, consuming the world for our own enjoyment. You see, desire is a relentless force within us, a force that battles against us each and every day. James reminds us of that. He reminds us of the process that desire and lust and other sins take us down, this road that it takes us down. James chapter 1, verse 13. Addressing Christians who are facing hardship and persecution and temptation. And he writes these words, "When tempted, no one should say, 'God is tempting me,' for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And after sin, when it is full grown, it gives birth to death." When we feed our lusts, we will never be content. We will always be hungry for more. And Jesus says you should hunger, but you should hunger and thirst for righteousness. James tells us there's a progression. There's a progression that takes place. It begins with desire. You give in to that desire, and there is sin. And ultimately, that sin leads to death, separation from God. Several years ago in Brazil, there was a major radioactive contamination event. Very unfortunate event. And it began with a medical clinic deciding to move locations. And so they left their current location, but unfortunately they left behind a capsule that contained radioactive material that they used for cancer treatments. Well, the building, the facility was partially demolished, but there was still some parts of it standing, and two men illegally got into the area, and they discovered this capsule. And they looked at it, and they thought, this has some value. This has some scrap metal value, and so they took it home with them. And one of the men began to look at it, and he decided that he wanted to see what was inside, and so he took something, and he managed to puncture a hole in the window there, the thick window of this capsule. And he saw this blue glowing light. And he was mesmerized. Ultimately, they ended up selling it to a scrapyard. And the owner of the scrapyard saw this blue light emanating from this capsule. And he was mesmerized as well. He invited his friends over to see it, his family to see it. And finally, he took the capsule apart. And he discovered what he described as a bluish glowing dust. And they took out this dust and they handled it. And he had people come over and look at it because they thought it had some kind of supernatural power. They began to rub it on their skin. Well, later they discovered, obviously, that it was radioactive material. And that accident that situation caused the death of 4 people and contaminated over 100,000 people. They had to destroy several houses on that street. Maybe you can make the connection. Something that looked so inviting, something that looked so beautiful, so intriguing, so interesting, so desirable. They couldn't look away. And yet, ultimately, it cost them their lives. That's the nature of lust. Lust can destroy you. That's what James says. He says, desire gives way to sin, and sin leads to death. Lust can destroy you, but it doesn't end there. There's good news. You can destroy lust with God's help, with the power of the Holy Spirit. You see, there has to be a death. James says, if you continue to give in to it, it will be your death. But Paul writes in Colossians chapter 3, verse 5, there is a different death. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Paul says, yes, there must be a death, but it doesn't have to be yours. You can put lust to death. Satan wants to use lust to drag you away, to entice you, to get you to walk down a path away from God that ultimately leads to death. But that's not your only choice. Paul says you can put lust to death. It's not always a quick death. Sometimes it's a slow, difficult death. But it's time to put it away, to kill it, to bury it, to get rid of it. It probably won't happen on your own. You certainly need the help of the Holy Spirit. And you may need the support and the accountability of a trusted friend or two to help you kill lust. Maybe even the encouragement from this family of faith. You say, well, that sounds so extreme. You're talking about death, dying, and destruction. Seems kind of extreme, doesn't it? I mean, after all, everyone does it, right? Do you remember what Jesus said? Back to his words in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, if your eye causes you to sin, do what with it? You pluck it out. If your hand causes you to sin, you cut it off. You get rid of it. And we read that and we think, whoa, wait a second. Again, very extreme. And some people throughout the ages have actually taken Jesus' words literally. Now, I tend to think, as he does in many other places, Jesus is using exaggeration. He's using hyperbole. Why does Jesus use this extreme language, this hyperbole? To make his point hit home. To say this is very serious. It's so serious, he says, that you should cut off a part of your body if it's keeping you from doing what honors God. Just as God can transform us from the inside out, lust can destroy us from the inside out. And so Jesus says to take extreme measures in your battle against lust. Don't give it life. Job. You remember Job in the Old Testament? The man who endured so much suffering. So many bad things happened to him. And his friends came around and, looking for support. They kind of start that way, and then they say, wait a second, Job. We're trying to get to the bottom of this thing, and we have pretty much assumed and discovered, and we kind of think that it's your fault. God is disciplining you because you have done something wrong. And so Job goes on the defense, and he says, I really haven't. I'm trying to honor God. I'm trying to live in the right way. And in his defense, he talks specifically about lust. Did you know that? This is what Job says in Job 31, verse 1. I have made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a young woman. Job says, no, I've made a decision in this area beforehand. I made a covenant with my eyes. Jesus says, pluck your eye out if it causes you to sin. And Job says, I don't want to get to that point. I want to make a covenant with my eyes. We have an agreement. Will you make a covenant with your eyes? Will you resolve beforehand? Because when confronted with the opportunity to look, to linger, to lust, there's a chance you will likely give in more times than not. So make a covenant. And this is more than a promise to yourself, okay, I'm going to do better. This is a pledge to God. Asking for God's help, the Holy Spirit to help you, and putting safeguards in place. Changing your routine, putting some things in place for accountability, for support. Some spiritual scaffolding to hold you up and to hold up the commitment you are making. Will you do that? Because when sin remains secret, it flourishes. But when sin is exposed, it begins to lose its power over you. You see, secrecy is the fuel that gives lust its power. Secrecy is the fuel that keeps lust going. Will you make a covenant with your eyes? I want you to know that if this is a struggle for you, there is hope. Yes, Jesus seems to come down hard on this. Jesus has strong words to say about lust. But this is the same Jesus who continually offers forgiveness. God is a merciful God. And God does not want any of us to live a life oppressed by lust. He wants to set us free. Free from the power that lust can have over us. He wants us to live an abundant life, a life of peace and joy and purpose. That life can be yours. It begins with confessing and repenting, making some changes, making that covenant that Job made, not just with your eyes, but with God. Maybe for you, that means today you need to reach out. You need to reach out and ask for support or prayers or encouragement, forgiveness. We would be happy to offer any and all of that to you. We'd be happy and honored to lift you up in prayer. You can certainly do that by coming down front when we stand just a moment to sing this song. But let me also remind you that we have a couple of shepherds and their wives that will be going to the parlor, the room right behind me. And maybe this is something that would be more appropriate for you, just to kind of slide out one of these back doors and go in there and spend some time with them in prayer. And maybe it has nothing to do with lust for you, but you still need prayer and encouragement, or maybe you need to confess something else. They stand ready to receive you in there and to pray over you, and I'm so thankful for that. And certainly, we do the same in here this morning. Or maybe you're ready right now to give your life to Christ, to say, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that He walked on this earth, that He died on that cross, but He didn't stay there. God raised Him from the dead. And I want that same resurrection power in me. Maybe you're ready today to give your life to Christ, to be baptized into Christ. If that's the case, we celebrate with the angels in heaven, and we invite you to come as we stand and sing.